And we'd now like to welcome Dr. Deborah Towns OAM, who's coming to us from Melbourne in Victoria. Good to see you, Dr. Towns. How are you?
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and found it a bit overwhelming to try and fit it in. Anyway, it's Deborah Towns, Dr. Deborah Towns, and don't know what else to say, really. I mean, I've been interested in trying to improve the education and training opportunities for women and girls for a very long time, in my own time at school, but ever since, really, I guess. So very interested and done a lot of research, and feel we're chasing our tails generally and need to go back to the past perhaps and start again. I don't know. Anyway, I'm happy to answer questions, I think, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, you're certainly downplaying your qualifications, Deborah Towns. Deborah Towns holds a BA, a Bachelor of Education, a Master of Education, and a PhD. And I've known you since you were the Equality Officer, I'm not sure what the title was, in the Department of Education. And this is back 70s or 80s, when all that work was done on making sure that if a boy wanted to play with dolls, that was fine. If a girl wanted to play with trains, that was fine, and so forth. We don't need to get into all that, but I just want to make it clear that you were the coordinator for the elimination of sexism in schools in 1977 in the Department of Education. So why don't I ask you then how you first became involved and aware of the difficulties facing women in this area of education, leading on, of course, to employment and so on. What was your Rubicon that you crossed in this area?
I suppose I was always aware of it, but didn't articulate it. And when I went to university in the early 70s, I read Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch, and of course just started to identify with, you know, so much, and then got involved. I became a teacher, and as I think I mentioned there, the first year I taught was the first year women got equal pay, and I couldn't believe it. I just assumed teachers got equal pay with men. And also I joined Girls' School and Society. I read that, and also I joined the Australian Women's Education Coalition. I think that might have been when I first started going to meetings, and I think you spoke at one of those meetings, Jocelynne. Anyway, I got involved with the Australian Women's Education Coalition, which was an Australian group of feminist women who were interested in implementing the recommendations of the Schools Commission's report of Girls' School Society. And then the Schools Commission funded jobs in different states, and I applied for the job of the Elimination of Sexism Officer, and I got that job. And I guess, as they say, the personal is the political. I just had the opportunity to change things for other people, and the difficulties of it and the politics and so on was exciting but also depressing. But as Jocelynne said earlier, lots of things were achieved. I'm sure lots of things were achieved, and we did have parents interested in their girls staying on at school and studying maths and science. And there are all these sorts of projects back then. But I mean, if you look at changes such as I said in my report about, okay, more girls than boys now go on to university, but they are in courses that used not to be in university, such as primary teachers and nursing and other healthcare jobs. So we haven't changed in many ways. But the other thing I did want to say is it should be seen as a human rights issue. It's become a business case issue as well now, and it's still a human rights issue.
So I'd like to ask, how has Australia's implementation of its obligations pursuant to CEDAW, that is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, improved since Australia first adopted CEDAW in 1980 and then ratified it in 1983? What has improved for women over the last 50 years, and what has become worse?
Well, overall, in education, many things have improved for women. If you look at university, as I said earlier, the numbers of women in university, the numbers of women doing medicine and law, which is always seen as you know, important because they're well-paid, influential positions in the community. Women students are 50% at university, which they weren't 50 years ago. Engineering is an interesting one because it's never really got beyond about 13%, between 13% and 20% in universities across Australia. So, you know, there are those improvements, but I think, I suppose I'm talking about university there, but education is a big topic. I mean, one of the reasons girls and boys go to school is hopefully to go to university or get into a trade or get employment. I think in schools, again, retention rates, girls' retention rates are higher than boys, but it's often because boys can get employment more easily or they go into trades. One of the areas that I did mention, of course, was the trades area. It's an area that we looked at in the 70s and 80s. We had many programs to encourage girls into trades other than ladies hairdressing, and that's hardly changed at all. That's hardly shifted, that statistic there. I think it was 0.0% about in the 1980s. Now it's about 2% of girls. And you know, you have to look at what happens, the environment that the girls are expected to go into and the attitudes of the employers and so on. But as I've said, we're chasing our tails. I mean, we talked earlier about getting girls, say, to do physics. Now that statistic's hardly changed. The numbers of girls doing physics, physics. That's hardly changed in that 40 years. In the maths area, numbers have gone up, accounting, they've gone up, but then there's all these new subjects, which I talked about, the IT subjects, and the girls aren't going into those numbers, into those areas. It's sort of like, as I said, we're always catching our tails, and they're the really lucrative jobs. They're the jobs of the future. Girls are still going overwhelmingly into the care jobs. And I mean, that's important. We need people in the care jobs, but why don't we have boys in those care jobs? And of course, the whole issue of sexual harassment, I mean, the attention is being brought more to it these days, and so it should be. A lot of attention wasn't given to it back in the 70s and 80s, but we noticed that in technical schools in Victoria and in some high schools in Victoria, sexual harassment was a real issue for girls, and we did bring out a kit in the 1980s talking about sexual harassment. And we asked schools to act upon it, and not much happened. Universities are also talking about sexual harassment. Now, maybe more students are reporting sexual harassment, and I think that's a very, very serious area. And it's also one of the reasons why I guess girls don't succeed in many jobs. You know, I think I mentioned too, I interviewed women principals of some of our top girls' schools, and the girls achieve so well in those schools, but it doesn't continue onto the workplace. I mean, the term the principals themselves used was that the girls are decapitated in the workplace. So you can't divorce education from the outcomes, the employment, and I think that's terribly important. It's about the stereotyping. Now, that was mentioned in the various CEDAW dot points about stereotyping and discrimination, and we know that the early years of learning are terribly important, the early years of growing up for children, health-wise, mental health-wise, learning the basics, but that's also where they learn about appropriate behaviour and appropriate careers. And lots of research was done years ago that there's still a huge issue with discrimination and stereotyping in children's literature and children's readers. I mean, I mentioned there 50%. Over 50 years, it's hardly changed. And a colleague of mine who's an IT whiz, she developed a coding for school readers at her son's school, 120 school readers in one Australian series, which had animals in it. And I sometimes think authors put animals in and think, well, that's okay, they're animals. So racism and sexism doesn't apply to animals. So they have all these animals, but then the animals get men's and women's names. And the characters were overwhelmingly, most active characters were overwhelmingly boys and men. And that's still happening now in 2023. We still have school readers. And I've spoken about it with teachers, and I've spoken about it with the Education Department in Victoria. We had a policy 50 years ago that you couldn't have sexist school readers, but you can now because schools choose their own readers, and you go and see the schools and they say it's not an issue. These are very good for teaching phonics. or you point it out to another person and they say, oh, I hadn't noticed that these books were racist and sexist, and then they just dismiss it as though, well, these are readers, you know. And I do think it's not so much backwards, it's sort of an unawareness of racism and sexism. It's sort of like it's a separate subject. But as I said, the first 7 years of learning are just so important. And unfortunately, we don't ever challenge these readers, and we don't ever challenge the attitudes of children. And I know there's research that says we shouldn't talk about girls losing confidence, or we have to term it something else. But there does seem to be, and that's an argument for having single-sex girls' schools. They don't lose their confidence. But there is an argument for girls not being as confident about what their lives could be the older they get. And it's not just me who says that. I'm a grandmother now as well, and I can see that in my own grandchildren. There's a change in the little girls and the little boys, and there seems to just be a difference. And I don't know. As I said, I'm getting on a bit here, but I just find it a little bit frustrating. And you know, that you feel like you're reinventing the wheel, or you're making a mountain out of a molehill, but it's not, because look at homelessness with older women because they haven't been able to accumulate enough superannuation. I mean, these issues are life issues that really have to be challenged in the first 7 years of children's schooling. It might not be the school, but it's when they're at school most of the day up to the age of 7. They're being influenced in so many ways, and it probably needs to be more challenged in our schools.
Good. I just want to note, I work in adult education, and one of the things that I've observed is the amount of women working in studying or in what we consider traditional male areas from other countries. It's very strongly, there's a stark difference between the women coming through our system and the women that come in from other countries, and I'm including Europe, where a huge amount of engineers and other male-dominated areas here are supported and occupied by women. You come to Australia and they're frightened of moving into those areas, and where does that fear start setting in? It's not when they make the choice to go to university, it happens long before. And I think it's to do, as you point out, in the school system. I just wanted to ask you, how has Australia failed to meet its obligations pursuant to CEDAW, and how is this impacting on women you know or assist?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that in a detailed way. I'm in the National Council of Women of Victoria, and I also know women who are in difficult situations. And I suppose, as I said earlier, you know, I see women around my age, and you know, they've worked all their lives. So that means in the 50 years that I've been involved in it, I would have known them, you know, when they were younger, and if I'd met them and so on. And I just feel, because we didn't act upon many of the findings of the CEDAW and Girls' School and Society and the legislation of the past, which, you know, is not able to change attitudes, unfortunately, because somehow we didn't act on all those recommendations. Here we have homeless women, we have unhealthy women, we have, you know, terrible examples of domestic violence because women become dependent on men. You know, I just feel, I can't go into the detail, but it's sort of obvious that the things that we would like to have done 50 years ago, that the challenges we would like to have confronted and the recommendations we'd like to have implemented in the education sphere, education and training sphere, because we stopped funding these programs. They come in and out of fashion. I mean, I recently met a woman in her 40s, a very enthusiastic woman in her 40s, wasn't even born when I was doing the sorts of things I was doing. and she's so enthusiastic about, I can't remember her name, and I've sort of said that I'd sort of, mention this at some stage, that I don't want her to burn out. But I mean, she's in that trade training area, and she's been very successful in other jobs. But I think trying to change those attitudes over that 50 years really hasn't been followed through sufficiently. And I mean, I know we're sort of leaving boys and men out of it, but as I said earlier, there is an old boys network, whether you like it or not, there is an old boys network. I really think the schooling in a way reinforces this entitlement, and I think that's what happens. I mean, and I've spoken to groups of boys and girls at university, and they don't want to hear about gender equity. They just don't want to hear about it, and the girls are embarrassed by it, and because they want to be seen as one of the boys, so if they're doing engineering or law or medicine, they don't want to see issues as women's issues and women lawyers and women doctors. But two really good examples recently, a woman professor in medicine at Melbourne University, I won't mention her name, but she recently told me, she's in her 50s, when she started in medicine, she was not interested in women's issues. But the longer she stayed in medicine, the more she's become a very strong feminist, because she knows that research isn't done on women. Women's health is an issue. And another woman I know who was the Dean of Engineering at Monash, the first woman Dean of Engineering, I think, in Australia, she was exactly the same. She said the longer she was working in the engineering area, an aeronautical engineer, very successful, the more feminist she became, because she was so uncomfortable with the working environment she had to be in. And we lost those women back in the 80s and the 90s because they wanted to be successful engineers or successful doctors. But I just think, I don't know, I don't have the answer to it, but we have failed. We've failed these homeless women. We've failed these women victims of domestic violence. The government has failed them. Whether it's the education system, and I don't think we can only talk about education within, the purview of the Minister for Education. All government departments are responsible to ensure that people have access to education, support when they're at school, and have training and be able to have a proper wage. And it's all government departments, not just education. I mean, education is just so important for so many reasons. So we have failed.
So just in question 9, it says, what needs to change now and how can these changes best be achieved? Obviously you mentioned education from an early age. What else?
I can't remember. I think I said a few other things. I'm getting a bit carried away here, aren't I? I've left my notes in the other room.
Well, why don't we use it? Oh, sorry.
Well, sorry.
I was going to say you referred to Girls, Schools and Society of 1976, and you said something about that. Perhaps you'd like to expand on that. Sorry, I shouldn't have across you.
Yeah, well, I guess that, the important thing is, as Girls, School and Society has said and other research has said, is that if we have a program where we want to be effective and bring about change, we have to keep monitoring that program and maybe have to adjust it so that if there's a change in the community, for example, as I said earlier, if IT is now the area to go in, well, we should be ensuring that more young people, feel confident with the IT area. We have to keep adjusting this along so that, why is it that women have increased in medicine and increased in law, but not in engineering? Why is that? That's what we should be looking at, instead of just having more and more programs to get girls into trades. So we need to monitor and evaluate. And as I said earlier, respect the people and the work that was done back in the 70s and 80s. It's almost like, nothing really happened back then. Well, why don't you have a look and see why nothing happened? I mean, the government spent millions and millions and millions of dollars. So I think we have to monitor these programs so that this trade program that's getting millions at the moment, we have to keep monitoring this program. Why is it that girls aren't going into trades? Why don't we have more men going into the caring professions? And I mean, one of the answers is maybe because it's not paid enough. Why don't we have more men staying home looking after children? I mean, the attitude towards the men who are interested in staying home is that they're not serious about their career. So, you know, as I said earlier, it's a human rights issue. We should be ensuring that people have this education, and we monitor, you know, the person's life, their ongoing life. We don't just accept that they've dropped out. Well, why did they drop out? Because it's so much more expensive for the community to pay for homelessness and the diseases that people get because they haven't been able to feed themselves properly. So I guess what I'm saying there is we just have to follow on these programs, because we know we keep having these, you know, we're having another education review at the moment. And, you know, one of my main areas is education, of course, and we've had about 50 reviews of education in years, and we never implement the recommendations. But if we did implement the recommendations, it's sort of like such a waste of people's time and money to not follow through on these programs. So I suppose I'm saying too much, but in the short term, when we do these programs, let's monitor them and find out exactly what happens and why did they fail, because we don't seem to do that.
Helen, did you have something?
I'm aware of the time, and but I think that question about monitoring and following up is really important. It's the same in questions of harassment at university, and you know, there's there's quite a few reports and surveys and everything being done, but very little to kind of follow through, isn't it? The reports just sit there. So that, I think that emphasis on monitoring and following through is something that's really, really important in this area.
Yeah, talking about the sexual harassment, I did give a talk a while ago at a business group. I was asked to talk about it as a result of the human rights report. And I said, if I think it's 2 out of 5 women are sexually harassed in the workplace. And I was with a group of about 300, 400 people. And I said, that means in your workplace, you are either sitting next to or in front or behind a sexual harasser. And I think that's the way to look at it. What we shouldn't be looking at women as victims of sexual harassment. We should be turning it around and saying, you are in this workplace with sexual harassers. And that really shocked people. Some people objected to what I said, but other people said that was really great. Because why should women always be seen as the problem? You know, they're not the problem in this issue, and they're not the problem in so many other issues. And it's another way of educating people about this issue. And I think Helen who said about the sexual harassment in universities. As I said, I don't know if it's increasing or not, but it's being reported more and hidden. It's definitely hidden. Universities don't want this information to come out. And as you know, there was a report of 39 universities. They don't want this information to come out, but they don't want to do anything about it either. They don't want to address it. And
you're absolutely right. And yes, and they don't want to educate women about what it is either, because when you say, you know, 2 in 5, I'm kind of, no, that's low. You know, and women simply often don't recognise these what is done as harassment or discrimination. They just accept it as part of the landscape.
I wonder, when we have these wonderful programs recommended and introduced, what happens to them? They disappear. Why do they disappear? I mean, part of that concept of implementing things is only useful as long as we're allowed to. And where do they go? I mean, we've had, particularly I'm New South Wales, and we had some wonderful activity going through the Department of Education many years back under the Rand government.
oh yeah, I remember.
Where have they gone? They've been stopped.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm still a colleague of.
Sorry, I was just saying, is that political intervention?
Well, I've just got some other notes for something else I gave a while ago, which comments on what we're talking about, and it's just that we keep doing the same sort of research, and the UK has a wonderful program they call the the limit lifting program in their education department. I'm very impressed with it, and I talked to our education department here in Victoria about it, and they said, "Oh, we can't do that. We've got the respectful relationships program, but we can't talk about sexism generally, and we can't talk about it in the curriculum, and we can't talk about it here and there," which is why I talked about it as being a superficial program, because they do like a 1 hour respectful relationships once a week, and then that's it. You know, and whereas I felt that the program that the UK Education Department has been implementing, I mean, I'm not in the UK, I know you are, Jocelynne, but I think that seemed to be a better program. Again, I'd be interested in if it's in its success and how well it's being evaluated, but there just is still this continuing problem, and I completely agree with Kerry. Is it Kerry about, you know, we should be evaluating, and I'm still a colleague with Jocelynne Sobski, who was, you know, had a similar job to me in those days, and she was also in the Australian Women's Education Coalition. It's very frustrating. We just sort of see these reiterations happening instead of learning from what's happened. And as I said before, respecting the women who worked in these jobs in the past. I mean, what happened to them? You get burnt out, you do other things. You're seen as boring because you keep harping on the same thing all of the time, but it's all still there. And a new group come along with new research, but it's really just repetitive. And, you know, as I said, we seem to be chasing our tails in so many ways. And I do think we have to think about how we get, you know, the boys to change and the environment, the system to change, so that you know, we don't have environments that sexual harassment is sort of enabled, really, and not called out. That's why we called our kit sexual harassment out in the open, but we called our kit that back in 1984. But, you know, it's sort of like, oh gosh, we can't really talk about it, you know.
Did you have something, Mary? No, Mary. So we'll say thank you, Deborah. I just want to say on the England issue, in the secondary school, there is a women's activism group, Sexism in Schools, and they're concerned about the curriculum, and their research shows that in the English literature area, for example, women get one category, one day really of teaching, and the women are allowed to be on the poetry. So that if it's about poetry, you can have women poets, but everything else, drama, novels and so forth, no women. And so they're activists that way, yeah. I just want to conclude too by saying I'm so pleased that you raised the issue, not just of the wages gap, but the consequence, which is the pensions gap and the women who don't have houses. And why I want to refer to this is, I'll never forget running into you on the corner of Collins and William Street in Melbourne. I was on my way to VCAT, the Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal, and you were dancing up the street because you were just about to make your final payment on your mortgage. Now, it stuck in my mind because I thought, that's wonderful, Deborah. How fantastic. But you see, if you'd been in a male profession, not in education, you would not have been just paying off your mortgage on your house. You would have had a block of flats. You would have had a couple of houses, and it was you were at a high level position as a woman in the education department. You had all the qualifications you had, and yet because of the wages, the pay in the education sector for women, that was your situation. And I'm so glad you were dancing up the street. It was wonderful. But this is what went through my mind. I don't think I probably said it to you at the time. But thank you so much, Deborah. Really good to have had you, Dr. Deborah Towns. And